Hello, my name is Leah. I do a little bit of leather work and I've put together a pattern for this little two-tone tote. It's made from vegetable tan leather and it's all saddle stitched, or most of it. There's a little detail on the sides which isn't, but mostly. And the tassel strap is optional. You don't have to put that on there. It looks quite nice plain. Just tuck that in and you can have a look. And it is just the right size for me. I wanted a bag like this that you can fit under the seat in front of you in public transport, and it's just easy to get at. It also stands up on its own. I can put it in my locker at work and just reach in and get stuff out. The bottom is light, so I can see what's right in the bottom of my bag. That's exciting. Anyhow, if you'd like to make this, have a look below. There's a link to the pattern and probably a couple of other things I think I'll put on there in between now and then, and I hope you enjoy it. Start by cutting the pattern pieces out and try to cut on the outside of the black line as neatly as you can. One other thing, when you're cutting this pattern, I want you to go, even though you're not cutting anything out here, it's just a straight line, I want you to cut right up, just cut that straight line right up the middle of that to the end of there, so that when we start stitching it just pulls more evenly. If I just start stitching here and the cut is here, I end up with a point, like a sudden bend in the leather, and I just want it to gracefully arch around. Then I stick it fairly well with sticky tape, but remember, sticky tape can mark your leather. So if you're using something expensive, don't put the sticky tape too much on the leather, just enough to hold it still. And I'm using diagonal or diamond punches. They make holes that slant at about a 30-degree angle, if you can see that. You can use a hole punch. These holes, you don't need to punch holes that big. The holes are this big just so that when you center your punch, it just makes it easier because you can still see the hole around the punch and you can see when you've got it centered much quicker than if you cover up the whole dot that's been put on there. So that's why they're so big. But this is a 2.5mm hole, and that's too big. You need maybe one, if you can get a 1mm hole, or a 1.5, but I think the best thing is to use these stitch punches because they don't actually take remove any leather. They don't make a hole, they just nick a slot into the leather and it will close up again after you stitch it. After some time you hardly see the cut at all. Okay, so I'll just punch. I haven't done any yet. So I'm aiming for the center of each dot. I'm just reusing the same piece. You can print as many, so you've got 4 brand new ones and you're using a new one every time, but I'm happy just reusing the same piece as much as I can. Most of the holes, this stitch punch is a 6mm spaced punch, and the distance is from the very tip, this very tip here, to that next tip. That's 6mm there. It's not the distance between here. It's the distance between the points. And this pattern's designed for a 6mm spacing. one. That will fold in half. The D-ring goes through that and that holds it onto the bag. I also have a little bit of padding to put in the middle. It just makes it puff up and look a bit more posh. One down, 3 to go. I've cut all the pieces out and I'll go through and burnish the edges, or I'll sand off and burnish the edges of each piece, particularly the edges that are exposed when the product's finished. I'll also just bevel the front and the back of the exposed edges to smooth them off. I'll do that before I burnish. It just rounds the edge, makes it a bit tidier. And on the back I just get some of the residual fluff that's floating around on the top off. I've put a cross stitch pattern on the side to just as an accent, and I'll show you how I do that shortly. I've punched all the holes around the edges and it will pull in with the stitches to give the side just a little bit of shape. So I've attached a needle to each end of some thread. It's 8mm Ritza thread or tiger thread that I'm using. And I've pulled off, you need around about 6 times the length of the piece you're stitching to do this stitch, plus a little bit extra. It's annoying when you run out before you're finished. And I did actually do that on one of these. So I poke each needle through and then I'll pull them through to the front and make sure that I have enough thread on each, or even thread on each needle. And I'm going to be as consistent as I can. I'm going to cross over the same way every time just to try to keep these stitches looking tidy. And you'll end up with a cross on the front and just some little lines, horizontal lines on the back. So I'm going with the right needle into the left hole and then the left needle into the right hole, and I'll do it in that order every time. I'll pull them through and make sure that it's fairly snug. You don't want any loose thread. So once you've pulled it through and you think you've pulled it through, there's a bit loose, I need to tighten that up more. Turn it over, have a look and make sure it's sitting flat. Okay, so now we'll do the same thing, cross over, but we're not going down to the next stitch, we're just staying in the same holes that we're crossing over. We'll go now the right needle is going into the left hole and then the left needle will go into the right hole, and make sure you don't catch the thread with your needle. Check that it's firm when you've done it, or tight, and we'll do the next one. Okay, that looks good. I'll just keep going. These are the little padded pieces to go onto the handle brace, and it just gives it a bit more shape, a bit more padded looking. Now I experimented here. I'm using water-based contact adhesive, and it's something that I can find at the local hardware store. I've soaked some of them and just kept some dry. I just wanted to see how well this glue sticks. So I haven't really got enough water on that. You can see, well, it's called casing when you wet the leather, but I haven't put enough water into it. Really, I should have soaked it a little, cased it a little bit longer. And this piece goes in, and you make sure, I've punched the holes already, just make sure that you're clearing those holes. The little padded piece doesn't go as far as the holes that you've punched in. This is the glue I use. As long as it dries flexible and clear, it's generally fine. You can buy proper leather glue. By all means do that if that's what you want to do, but I find this works fine. I don't generally use glue for any structural purposes. It's just for when I'm stitching things together and I want something to stay put. once the stitching's done, that's where the strength comes from. So I used some dry bits and some wet bits, and I just slapped the glue on. I didn't wait for it to dry to tack. I just put it straight on there. And to cut a very long story short, they all stuck. They were all fine. I've got a front piece and a side piece ready to stitch together. Now the black piece, the front and the back pieces overlap the side pieces. I didn't glue this stitching line in place. I just thought I'd see how I go. I put a couple of needles in just to hold it level and started stitching. I did a double stitch at the start, continued down to the end and did a double stitch, a back stitch I should say, at the end as well. Make sure you've got enough thread. You'll need about, for leather this thick, you'll need about 3 times the length of the leather, plus always add a bit extra on. And that should see you through to the end. I don't have terribly strong wrists and or hands. I do sometimes have trouble pulling the needles through. So I use these jeweler's pliers, which don't have any teeth. They don't damage your needles. You can get them at jewellery making supply shops. Excuse me, but I should show you the brand in a moment. I'll turn it up the right way. Maybe you can Google this name and you'll find a store close by that sells them. I'm not affiliated with them. It's just something that I find is a really handy tool. You'll also see me using some parallel closing pliers. These are like a bird beak closure, but the parallel ones close flat on each other. They're very good. They were a bit more expensive, but these work really well too. I sometimes struggle pulling the needle through, and if you're going to pull the needle through and you haven't done this before, make sure you pull straight away like that. Don't reef the pliers. Hopefully I'll show you here. I'm doing a voiceover, so this isn't live. Here we go. Don't do that sort of motion because you'll bend the needle. Try to pull straight on. I've reached the end and I'm just trimming the edges off. I use polyester thread so I can singe the ends back. So I've just got my handy flamethrower and I'll melt those back. And what I'm trying to do is just squash the ends so they're too fat to get back through the hole. And I think I burnt my finger in the process. Yes, I did. I'll have a look now, see about which way I want to fix the bag base on. I don't know whether to do the finished side or the grain side up. I decided to do the grain side up. I thought the finished side would probably be a bit more sturdy and handle being dragged along the ground and pushed and shoved around. So these stitches need to bend at a right angle in order for me to lift the side of the bag up. So I'm going to do a bit of wet forming. I've just got one of those cotton pad things that you use for makeup. Some of them have like a woven surface and they don't lose fluff as much. Unfortunately, these don't. So I end up leaving a bit of a white trail of fluff on the inside. But what I'll do is saturate it, and I'm wetting it just above the line of stitches. So when I fold it, the whole stitch is going to be laying flat on the base. And it takes a bit of soaking. This black leather is about probably 2.5 mil thick, which I think would be maybe 1/8 of an inch, I'm not sure. And now I'll fold it and it's still quite stiff. If I left it for a while it might bend easier if I left it for a few minutes, but I'll just keep wetting it. And I'm trying not to wet the tan side because you can get watermarks left behind. Probably would have been easier to have done this before I stitched the side and the front together, but yeah, there's a bit of fluff getting left behind. It's starting to bend a bit better now. If I might have to wet it one more time, but you'll know when you bend it and it takes a bit of pressure to get it to bend. You'll know, yeah, look, it's staying. I probably don't need to do much more, but here we go, I'm doing it again. The tan sides, they're thinner. They would be probably 1.5 mil thick, and they don't need wet forming. They'll bend anyway. Now, I studied cosmetic science for a while, and I got hold of learnt what some of the ingredients in Tote are. So I had a bit of an experiment, and I've come up with my own. So that's what this is that I'm using. I'm just using an old, like a credit card style. It's actually my bus pass, but I'm smoothing all the fibres down. This is the first time I'd done this, and it worked really nicely. I made it just for the purpose of burnishing the edges of leather, but it really works well with this. And the ingredients are also good for your human skin, so you know, don't go wiping it off on a rag, just rub it into your fingers. That I am planning on putting it on my Etsy shop, but it won't be happening for about a month. At the time of filming, which is April 2023, it's probably going to be another month before I have that in the shop. I'll stop playing with it in a moment, and that'll be done. Now this is one of the handles, and this is the cord that I used to fill it with. It's just piping cord from a soft furnishing or a haberdashery shop. If you're using this, you need to sticky tape both ends. Wrap it about a bit over 1 inch just to secure it, because it frays really quickly. And I wrap enough so that when I cut it off, there's still sticky tape on the piece that I'm not using, so that doesn't fray. Now this is the length handle you get if you just join two of the handle pattern pieces together. If you want to make it longer, you can just print another copy of the bag handle and cut a piece off and put it in the middle and make it as long as you like. But this handle is long enough for just to hold at your elbow, but if you want to sling it over your shoulder, you might need a bit more distance. Now that's well and truly secured. I've done the other end as well. Now this needs to sit just below the last stitch before the gap for the D-ring. You'll see a gap in the stitching there where the D-ring sits. Now the piping needs to sit just below the last stitch at the base, just so that there's room when you fold it over and stitch it together, there's room to get the D-ring in. So it'll sit about there. I've sped this up. I'm just putting a little bit of glue on there. I'll let it sit for a few minutes. I'm just gluing this in place so it doesn't flop all over the place when I'm trying to stitch the handle up. I've also trimmed a little bit of the bulk off. I made sure not to cut the full length of the sticky tape, so there's still a bit of sticky tape holding it around. But I'm just thinning the end off just so it's not quite so bulky. Now it's only probably a third dry, but that's enough. I've found that it'll stick anyway. And I'm centering it. From here it really doesn't look like I'm doing a very good job of centering it, Leah, but there you go. Okay. Burnishing. I've whipped this. You can see the texture of it. It doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't drip. It just sits on your finger. And you can just rub it in with your finger. You don't need your burnishing tool. Not on leather this thin. You just, well, just matting down the ends. So what I'm going to be doing is just stitching from here to the tip on that side. And once I get there, I'll be stitching all the way down this side and continuing on right down to the end. Then I'll get here and I'll go from here up this side, and then I'll do another short one over here. So I'm going to start with a short one, and what I'll do is I'll put the D-ring in there. This is my D-ring, how they separate. I'm not sure whether it's better to have these or the set cast ones that don't separate, but I thought I'd give one of these a try. I'll just put this bit in. Okay, well I've done that shorter side, and I'll just trim those threads so they're out of the way. Now that's where you would normally end your last stitch, but because I now want to start stitching across the handle, I need to poke my right needle back through that hole That was the last movement I did. I'm just reversing that. Now I'm going to take, I've got one needle in the right, thread in the right place. Now this thread needs to go into the corresponding hole on the other side. And you'll see it's going through the last stitch you did on that short run. And now they're even. So now you start stitching as you would normally, going down the handle. Once you've done a couple of stitches, you'll be able to pull it tight and you'll see how it all sits together. Now I'll pull this firmly, and that's probably a bit too snug. It's just popping up, so just let it go a little, give it a push. Now that's sitting fairly well. I'm going to give the edges a sand later, and that will smooth it down a bit. And now we'll just continue on to the end. Okay, so we've stitched all the way along, and now I'm up to this folding piece. I've got to stitch 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 holes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and there's 6 on the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we've got the gap in the middle. So what we do, I'm just going to come into the top of that first of the 6 stitches and come out through the middle. On this side, I'm going to go into the first of the 6 stitches, and I'll come out right across. Pull it tight. Now I've got this needle in the right place. It's in the top of the 6th stitch, and I'm going to put this through the first of the 6 stitches on the flap. There. Now I still have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stitches untouched, and down here there's 5 I haven't touched. There we go. That's in. Now I'm going to just do a couple of back stitches. Now it's all stitched together, and you can see that it isn't even all the way along. One side's sticking up a bit more than the other. So I'm just going to trim some of this off with my knife. But I have a belt sander at the back, so I'm going to sneak out there and just sand it all down with that. And then I'll use my beveling tool to just take any unnecessary fluffy bits off the sides, and it'll be ready to burnish. Okay, that's done. It's done a fairly good job, but there's just one little spot that flattened down and didn't sand off, so I'll just finish that off. The rest of it looks okay. Now I'll get my leather lube out and dampen it all down. I aerated the mixture so that it was not runny, it'd just stay put. I don't know if I've already said that. And I think I will call it leather lube. One or two of the ingredients are used in personal lubricant, which is what gives it the really good slip. But I don't think anyone would be offended by that. Okay, so I'll put this all the way down, then I'll get my little burnishing tool, which is supposed to go on a Dremel and spin around, but I use it just in my hand. I've got to find a clean spot because I've been burnishing dark leather and you don't want stains all down your edges. And that's all smoothed down. That is all it seems to take. Now you can see the inside of the black leather is a little bit fluffy. I was interested to see how well it's smoothed down, and the edges where I'm stitching are folded at a right angle. It's all dry. That's good. And you can see it's a little bit rough, so I'm going to just seeing which way, if there is a direction that the fibres lay, and I'm going to thread some of my leather lube on it all and see how it smooths out. And I can tell you this was one of the most satisfying things I've done in a while. Look at that, it just smoothed and it stayed smooth. I went over it a couple of times because I thought when it dried it might loosen up, but it's just stayed flat. And it just glides on, it's lovely. And it doesn't seem to use a lot of product. I slapped a bit on there to start with, but I think I ended up with a bit still spare, not that it didn't soak up. And I put a preservative in it, so the surplus you can put back into the pot. It won't go off. But there was a bit left. Okay, now we're going to fix the base to the front. I'm just making my mind up as I go doing this. This is the prototype that I'm building. Now it's just a matter of getting it on an angle that you're comfortable with. When you're working at a right angle, it's difficult to access and see what you're doing on both sides without moving your project around a lot. So I line up that first stitch with the first stitch on the front of the bag. And I'll continue on. I've got the first stitch in, which was a little bit fiddly, holding it still, and I decided to put a couple of pins in just to hold it and give it some support as I go. Once I have a few stitches on, it's much easier to handle and it just stays aligned. Now I'm at the end and it's the last stitch, so the last stitch that comes through to the back of the base and then through the front of the bag, and then I need that last stitch to go through the first hole in the side. So I'm going through all 3 layers. So that was the very last stitch at the end of the black front piece, and it joins in with the first stitch on the side. So they're all secured together now. Now I'll make my way along. Actually, I think I decided just to stitch the front black flap on and then I did the back. Yeah, that's right. I'm putting the back flap on while I can open it up and see what I'm doing. I thought I'd do the 2 big pieces, the big stiff pieces, and then the flexible sides are going to be much easier to stitch. So I'll do those after I've done the front and the back. Just thought I'd have a look and see for a comparison what the smooth downside looked like compared to the piece where it still had all the piles sitting up loose. It's quite a difference. I was really pleased with that. Now what I'm going to do is, these are the pieces that latch on or onto the bottom of the strap, like that, and stitch onto the side of the bag. Now you'll notice that I have punched holes on both sides, but what I will do, the pattern I'll change. I'll just have the holes on one side, so you just punch the one side holes, and then when you fold it over and glue it together, you can punch right through, so it goes through to the other side, and then they'll line up perfectly. I'll dampen them now and do a bit of wet forming. I'm going to get a hold of a bone folder or bone tool and just press down right up against the side of that padding, trying to get the part where the stitches will go in flat. So this is why you need to, the little padding piece needs to be away from the stitching line, so you have enough room to be able to stitch it and have your stitches sit flat. And also some of these pieces weren't perfectly symmetrical, so I did a bit of sanding once the leather had dried, just to align the points. Now I'm going to use the pattern to help me line up the handle braces. The very tip just goes into the base of that little curve that's drawn on the mat, on the pattern. You'll see that there's 2 styles on there, but I deleted one. Style 1 was just too chunky, so I've just put the one style in the pattern. You can always change them, make them a slightly different shape if you like. But I just need to center it on the base of that little curve and then line it up by eye. So I'm just putting the all through each of the stitch holes, being careful not to stab the thread itself. And when I line up the second one and I'm happy with where it is, I'll do the same. Now I've stitched the front and the back on, I'm ready to work on the sides. And you'll see there, I didn't have quite enough thread to finish the cross stitches on the sides. There's a stitch at the bottom missing. But I'll fix that later. Now, we're going to do the same thing, go through that last hole on the straight stretch that goes through the base and the front, and then it will go through that first stitch on the side. There's the missing cross stitch. So I need to, the thread's already come up here, it has to go through here.
So is that when the building's underneath the grass? Yeah, the two ground towers have been here for about 10 years by this time. Now this major...
Now we're ready to stitch.
For banquets and for masks and dances.
I will be turning it around. I want the stitch hole leaning up away from me, which they're doing now. I've moved to the couch where it's a bit more comfortable, and I'll keep stitching. I'll do both sides, and then I'll catch up with you again when I start to wet form the handles. But now I've done a couple of stitches, I'll be able to tighten it up and it'll look a lot tidier. That's better. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to encourage the handles to curve in a relaxed sort of a way. Instead of, if I keep it like this, I might get buckles up here. If I wet it and then form it into an arch and hold it in place until it dries. Now I have that piece of cotton cord in the middle, so I'm not going to put it in the water so long that it saturates the cord. It's going to just be dipped in, taken out, and I'll set it aside for about 2 or 3 minutes, and then I'll form it. That will do it. That will slowly soak in that little bit of extra water. Actually, I'm going to just dip the ends again because it has to be consistently wet or you get watermarks when it dries. I'll dip this one in. Make sure it's all wet. There's a little bit of resistance where I've been burnishing, but it'll be fine. That'll soak through. And the cord should still be pretty well dry. So we'll just let them sit for a minute. I forgot to hit play and didn't film this piece, but what I've done is grabbed some soft twine, which won't discolour the leather. So I've got some beigey stuff, and using a crochet hook, I threaded it through the loops, and I've just tied it off to keep that curve in it, so it'll just naturally form that curve. Okay, now we're going to put the handles on. It's the following day, and they've set in place. I'll just cut the string off. Very blunt scissors. Okay. So there's no, it just stays like that. And there it is. I quite like it without the strap on it, just plain like that. I've still got some tidying up on the base to do. I've still got needles attached on the inside of the bag, but I'll sort that out. And it stands up on its own. The handles fold down out of the way. Now this is the strap if you want to do the strap. I've cut out a piece of leather the same as the sides and a piece of lining, which is goat skin, and it's very thin. The only reason I want the lining is so that I can hide the snap that I put on there. So I'm going to glue both of those, and I will let this dry to a tack. I want this to stick fairly well because the strap is going to be bent backwards and forwards a lot. I'll stitch on the outside of the strap as well. So I'll spread that on and let that dry. Now the little dot on the strap down towards the bottom, that's where I want my snap to sit. So I'm just going to draw on either side of the scrap leather, the bit that will be cut off, just so I can keep track of where it will go. I'm using one of these little magnetic snaps. They stick together fairly well. Now there's a fat side and a thin side, and I'm using the thin side to put onto the lining because I don't want any bulk inside the strap handle. The bulky piece can sit on the bag itself. And I just want to make sure I've got the pins parallel to each other. And I'm going to let's check, are they parallel almost? They are now. Yep. I'm going to just push hard enough on the leather so that I leave an impression. And with a biro, I'm just going to make them a bit clearer so I can see what I'm doing. And I'll cut a little slot as wide as the little tabs. Trying to keep them symmetrical. And then I'll push the little tab through from the other side. Now one thing I would do differently, I'm about to bend those tabs over. That's what it will look like. I'm about to bend the tabs over on themselves. What I would do is turn that tab 90 degrees and cut the slot so I end up with like an equal sign, and I'll push the tabs through. And I'm going to open them out. If I did it again, I'd just open them out because by folding them over on themselves like that, I've created a bit of bulk. And you want to keep the bulk down to a minimum. So I'd turn it 90 degrees, cut the slots in, and then fold the little tabs outwards. Now I'm sticking the top on to the lining. And I'll cut around the edge with a scalpel. I've sped this up just to get it done quickly. This video is getting very long. I'm just going to scribe a line right around it. It just makes it look a little bit tidier. Then when I punch the holes, I'll be punching them just on the inside of that line. When I punch the holes, I shouldn't call them holes because I don't make holes, but when I use the punch, it just misses that little snap. I put a coat of top coat on it, just a low sheen top coat. It's still damp, but it will lighten up and even out. And I'm going to burnish the edges. I'm going to fix a tassel on the end here. I'm going to fold the end of the strap so it has a curved look and stitch it together. And when I'm stitching the first couple of stitches, I'll stitch the beginning of the tassel in as well to secure it. Now I'm not stitching that tassel in yet, but I'm going to stitch right round the strap except for the first 2 stitches because I'll be stitching them separately at the end. I'm going to freehand cut these little strands with the scalpel, but what I will do is put dots every 2 centimeters. I'll put them along the bottom and along the top, and as I hold the ruler to cut against to cut my strands, as I go backwards and I get to each set of dots, I can see if I'm still straight. Unfortunately, I didn't film doing that, but this gives you an idea. So I'll put them along the bottom and then I'll line them up in the same spot up towards the top. And just as I move the ruler backwards, I'll get to the first set of dots and I'll know if I'm straight or not. It's pretty easy to just, if you have gone a bit crooked, you can gradually lean the lines back again so that, or the cuts so that you're staying straight. Now I've put glue on just the one side. It's the same glue that I've been using. It'll be strong enough to just hold this wrapped up. I'm going to put another strip of leather on top of it which will secure it. And I forgot to film stitching the beginning of the tassel in as well. But basically just the very beginning of that bit that I'm wrapping, I stitch that in at the base of the strap using those 2 stitch holes that I didn't stitch when I was stitching around the band. And I've found that the length tassel I've done, I'll change the length of the tassel on the pattern, I'll make it a bit longer, but it was going to wrap and land right in the front of the tassel, so I just cut some off. So you can either do that, cut a bit off, or I'll make the pattern tassel template a little bit longer, so hopefully it won't do that on you. It depends how thick your leather is really, where it's going to end up. Now you can see I haven't put the top coat on the tassel, but I did put it on the strap. The difference in colour. And this is the piece that goes on the top. It's basically a triangle with like a broad strip at the top. And the very first cut I want to get it centered so that the point right at the base there is in the very middle of the first little strand. So I'm just cutting either side of that center point. And I'll put little dots on the leather so I can tell that I'm going straight. So once I cut that first one, I'm away. You can make your strands as thick or thin as you like. Now I'll just cut the whole thing out so you can see more clearly what I'm doing. And I'm just working outwards from one side of that center strip, and then I'll go back and work out from the other side. And now I'll center it on the front of the tassel and wrap it around the back.
To me, it looks like
It's too long, but that's
that
okay.
line is right in the center.
We'll just cut off what we don't need.
That means I'm going to be stitching.
So it looks pretty lined to me. I'm just going to make a mark on the back of it there. I'll pinch it in and get a hold of my gold pen that stands out on black leather. Put a little mark on the sides and up over just to the top so I can see it. And I'll that. And now I'll mark the other side, or track where it is. It lines up with one of the cuts I've made, so I'll just trim it off in line with that strand. Now I've glued both the top of the black tassel and the tan tassel, and I'm going to wrap it around. Now I just need to center the black piece on top of the tan piece. And wrap it around. Now I had, before I glued it, I punched a couple of holes in each end of the black piece because I'm going to do a little crisscross stitch to hold that in place. Now my trusty flamethrower ran out of juice, so I've had to use matches. And I also learnt that if I use my finger with a band-aid on it, I don't burn my finger. That's much better. I'll line up the bag strap the same as I did with the handle braces. And I'll go up, I think it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stitches up either side of the strap with my awl and just mark a little dot. And then I'll go back and punch the holes in and start stitching. It was late in the day and I was interrupted by somebody who heard me say the C-A-R word. So we had to go out for a short while. Because I've already stitched around the strap, I'm going to use some thread which is a bit thinner. I've been using 0.8 Rizza thread, which is the top one. And now I'm going to use the thinner one just because I'm going over the same thing again and I don't want it to look too bulky. So you can see I've flattened the thread out so it looks a bit fatter than 0.8 and 0.6 of a mil. But that's, in reality, that's what it looks like when you've stitched it and rubbed over it. That's the thickness of the thread. Now this is the bulkier side of the magnetic snap. I'm making sure that the little posts are parallel to each other. I'm going to push again. I've just got the scalpel there marking center. I've got a dot there now, so I'll just push the prongs in either side of that dot so that I get an impression. Do the same thing and then cut holes with the scalpel and push the
And here it
through.
is, the finished product. Thank you for watching the video. I know it was a long one, but I think it's worth it. It's a lovely little bag, and if you have made it or you're going to make it, I hope you or the person you make it for really enjoys it. Thanks again for watching.